Today's presentation is part of my wider research, part of my dissertation. And the general idea behind my research is to talk about refugees as a political category. And I use Russian refugees in Istanbul as a case study because I believe that it's in a big part because of these Russian refugees in Istanbul, the concept of refugee as we understand it today, political category of refugee, developed in a big measure during the stay of Russians in Istanbul. But first I wanted to deconstruct two words in the phrase Russian refugees. So first of all, Russian refugees, Russian is not exactly describes the community that came to Istanbul. Russians, we need to refer to Russians as people of former Russian Empire, and of course we know that in Russian Empire there were a lot of different peoples, and people who came to Istanbul were from North Caucasus, Mountain Caucasus, South Caucasus, Crimean Tatars, Kalmyks, Ukrainians, Poles, Baltic people, and Russians, of course. In Cossacks, they distinguish themselves as a separate category, not necessarily part of the Russian identity. Like it's a Russian identity, but it's something unique as well. So another thing about Russians, when I studied the documents of the Ottoman archive, I found at least 4 different categories of Russians that are mentioned in these records, and it's related to their status, to their role, their relation to Istanbul. So first category, I would say it's a Russian community that lived in Istanbul, permanent residents of Istanbul that were at the same time Russian subjects. Before the war, there was quite a constant permanent community of Russian subjects in Ottoman Empire, including Istanbul. During the war, they were deported into inland lands of the Ottoman Empire as the representative of enemy nation. So many Istanbulian residents, Russian residents, were sent into different places for the time of the period of the war. And when there was armistice, they started to petition their returning back to Istanbul, and slowly they came back. Some people were allowed to return, some others were still retained in their places as suspicious and something, because it was an ambiguous situation at that period. The relationship with Russia was very unclear. And the second type of Russians related to Istanbul were prisoners of war. They were imprisoned in different locations in the Ottoman Empire, but with the armistice they were also released, and many of them were sent back to Russia to fight the Russian Civil War. And many of them, and most of them, were in transit to, by the way, to Russia. They stopped in Istanbul, and many of them stayed in Istanbul because it was also again ambiguous times that not everybody wanted to go back to Russia and fight again, and they found ways to stay in Istanbul and not to proceed to Russia. These two categories very often were employed by the Ottoman Empire in construction battalions or construction camp. They built roads, and they participated in agricultural labor, again as a representative of enemy nation. So, but many of them also tried to escape, and while escaping, they also tried to come to Istanbul, caught or not caught. They were many of them found Istanbul as a convenient place to hide and to among other people in this time. The third category of Russians that can be related to Istanbul is people who supplied organized supplies to the city. When the city was occupied by the Allies, the Allied government wanted to establish connections, trade connections with Russians, anti-Bolshevik Russians in Crimea and South Russia, compensating for sidelining Germans and their allies. So they worked with the anti-Bolshevik governments in South Russia in supplying coal. Primarily, they tried to supply to bring coal from Crimea to Istanbul, and also there are many other goods that the Allies bought from Russians in South Russia and Crimea. This led to the wave of people related to trade, agents, representatives of different organizations, firms, communications, and another aspect of this, when the Allies occupied the city, Russians considered Istanbul as their rare base in their war against the Bolsheviks, and many people used Istanbul as a political center. In correspondence between Russian elites, they often mentioned Istanbul as a vivid place, important part of political life of Russia. So, and not only because Russians were still eager to take to consider Istanbul as their Tsargrad, as their potential assets, because there was a secret agreement between the Allies before the war, but also because of the practical reasons. Istanbul was used for families of the officers to rest from the war, and for wounded soldiers to be in hospitals and go back to Crimea and go back to South Russia. So it was very, very important base for Russian troops, for Russian armies, and for Russian traders as well. And finally, we are talking about Russian evacuees that came to Istanbul en masse around, there were a few instances of evacuation at the beginning of 1920 from Odessa and Novosibirsk, and also the biggest evacuation happened in November 1920. So these people that usually we consider them as refugees. So I will talk about them a bit later. So here is the time to talk about the second word in the phrase Russian refugee. So refugee is usually presented as victimized category, as dependent people, usually without voices, voiceless people. And that's our modern, our current understanding of the term refugee. But in the case of Russians who fled from Crimea and South Russia to Istanbul, they were refugees in terms of they were forced to relocate, and circumstances in these circumstances they lost property status, and they needed help of humanitarian organizations. But this fact alone did not make them refugees, because in our understanding, current understanding, because they were able and willing to struggle and to find different ways of survival strategies. Russians organized political centers in Istanbul, help centers, administration, different types of administration, different types of mutual assistance. And this also comes with the question of contribution and impact of Russians that it's very hard to measure usually. And we can talk about cultural impact and in music, in ballet, and painting and many other aspects. But it's very hard to talk about this without positive being involved in positive terms. And but anyway, these people were a very important part of the social life of Istanbul, and they were element of the life, at least in terms of economic aspects of social life of Istanbul. And here I wanted to focus a little bit on Russian on the involvement of Russian refugees into the life of Istanbul. First of all, many people, when they fled from Russia, they brought with them a lot of money. If you talk about rich people, they managed to collect some money from their previous places, and sometimes they were very they made sure to bring the all important documents about their property in Russia. So they documented it very well with advocates, and they brought the valuables and the assets with them as the documents. So they use these papers and they use this money to trade, to buy goods inside the Ottoman Empire. That it was a big blow for the Ottoman government. Because of the situation in Russia, this money already had no value, and even the valuable assets, the valuable papers that they brought with them, they also were not guaranteed by anything. So the Ottoman government prohibited the influx of Russian money into the Ottoman Empire, and was a big problem at that time. Many official governments even received payment from Russians by Russian money that created a lot of confusion and a lot of turmoil, because this money already had no any value. So the other thing that Istanbul, according to the diaries and records notes of refugees, Russian refugees, Istanbul was one of the most expensive cities of the time, even comparing to Europe and capitals of Europe. And many Russians used their valuable things that they brought with them, jewelries, gold, and like paintings and many other cultural and historical valuables, and they sold them in pawn shops. And this Russian valuable things eventually ended up in different places, collections of European people who were able to buy these things, and these things also contributed to the economic circulation of economic valuable things inside the city. Another aspect, the Russian diaries describe that inside the city there was a very commercial environment. So many tried to exploit this situation and to make money out of everything. And it was possible to create small companies, big companies, and Russians very often build like factory. They produced vodka. They opened many shops and many other stuff. And one of the main concerns of Russians were, I'm quoting, to find a capitalist, and usually Russians communicated more with Greek residents because they were mostly settled in Pera Galata, and their main concern was to find a Greek capitalist that would that would agree to loan money to Russians to open businesses. And sometimes, in many cases, Russians wanted to avoid paying taxes. For the Ottoman government, taxation, different types of taxes were very important at that period. It was one of the main incomes for the government, and specifically they mentioned Temasha tax for entertainment. And Russians sometimes utilized their ambiguous status as capitulation nation and tried not to pay different taxes, or they just tried to do it illegally or paid bribes to officials to avoid paying taxes. So they also, on the other hand, many of them still pay taxes, and this was also their contribution, their impact to the economic situation, to the economic life of the city. Another aspect, as was mentioned just before in the previous presentation, there was a housing problem, and while many buildings were confiscated from Turkish owners, from the owners of Istanbul residents, many Russians who could afford this, they rented a lot of houses, a lot of places from Istanbul residents. So they also contributed in this way, and they also were part of this economic system of the city. Now I wanted to say a few words about other Russians who could not afford to rent houses and were not so wealthy as some part of Russian refugees. Not all of them could create companies and could survive by doing some commercial activities in the city. Many of them needed humanitarian aid, and of course they received this. And I should say that many Russian organizations try to help the people who really needed some financial and other support. But on the other hand, Russians were too autonomous and too independent for the Allies. At some point, Russians were allowed to bear a weapon, and also their activity was too much for the Allies if we consider geopolitical situation in the world this period. It was related to their complex relationship with the Bolsheviks, that they started to make agreements with them, and the pressure from the Bolsheviks regarding this so-called White Russians in Istanbul. So it was quite ambiguous, and the Allies could not allow for the Russian organizations to be too independent and to take too much freedom in their activity in the city. So they preferred to categorize Russians as refugees, and specifically here we see the transition in the understanding of the term of refugee, when for the Allies Russian refugees represented a burden, and they wanted to control these people, and they wanted to regulate the help that the aid that they provided, and they restricted their settlement, they restricted their mobility in the city, and they tried to register them and to control these people. And on the other hand, we usually think about humanitarian aid to Russian refugees in Istanbul as coming from Western organizations. That was indeed a lot, and there was a huge help. But on the other hand, there was also Ottoman government that tried to help Russian refugees. There was one interesting document that I found that describes how the Ottoman government helped to relocate Russian evacuees from South Russia to Istanbul, and with the perspective to settle them in Istanbul. And after helping them financially, renting some ships and something in this way, they turned to Near East Relief, American Near East Relief, for reimbursement. And they received rejection from this organization. They said that they will not help people who is not permanent residents of Istanbul. And this leads us to the question of responsibility. So usually, traditionally, Ottoman Empire always embraced refugees, and they wanted to help Russians as well. But the situation, there were too many of them, and there was drainage of resources, and the Allies conveniently offered to the Ottoman government to delegate their responsibility for Russian refugees to the Allies. So the paradox is that Russians, when came to Istanbul to find refuge, they came to international Istanbul that was perceived by the Allies as the international city. And when eventually Allies needed to evacuate, Russians considered themselves as a part of the Allies and also wanted to evacuate with them. But on the other hand, the Ottoman government also considered refugees that come into the Allies and not to them. And I see here, it's still very preliminary, but I see that this is the way how the idea of delegating some part of responsibilities for refugees came to existence. First, the Allies wanted to take responsibility for the city, for the entire city, for the financial situations of the city, including refugees. And when it was too much for the Allies themselves, they also created an international organization that in turn also delegated some responsibility for refugees from the specific states to the international body. I'm talking about the League of Nations High Commission for Refugees. So it's still very vague, and it's still very tentative, but that's the direction of my research. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer. Thank you very much.